On behalf of our chairman, Ping Sun, and our president, Nicole, I want to welcome you all to this beautiful auditorium. I'm Charles Foster. I've served as chairman of the Asia Society, and I'm on the board. And for purposes of this evening, I'm co-chairman of our Committee on Policy and Banking. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce this evening our speaker, Ben Rhodes, a writer, political commentator, and national security analyst. Ben served from 2009 through 2017 as the Deputy National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. In that capacity, he participated in all of President Obama's key decisions and oversaw President Obama's national security communications, speechwriting, and public diplomacy. He also co-hosts of Pod Save the World. He is also a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC. He's chairman of National Security Action, which he co-founded in 2018 with his good friend Jack Sullivan, who happens at this time to be the National Security Advisor for President Biden. Ben wrote several books, one of which I have read recently, The World as It Is, where he discusses the time that he was in the White House at critical moments. And his latest book, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made. Now that book is for sale in the back after the program, and Ben has graciously agreed to stay to sign your book. He signed mine just a little while ago, so thank you very much, Ben. Ben's conversation will focus on the rise of nationalism around the globe, which is the actual focus of his book. Now, a few housekeeping measures. Please turn off your phone if you haven't already done so. I have to do mine in just a second. Wear your mask while you're in the theater, and please remain in your assigned seats. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, my good friend Mustafa Tamiz. Mustafa is an advertising expert, a national strategist, and former consultant on counter-violent extremism for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He regularly comments on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, an interesting combination. Also, I should point out that Mustafa serves on several boards, of course, the most important being the Asia Society Texas Center. Now, please give a warm welcome to Ben Rhodes, back to Houston, and to our moderator, Mustafa Tamiz. Gentlemen.
You know, you should continue applauding for Charles Foster for his years of service to Asia Society. Charles, thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is the new normal. We are in person, and then we're also streaming live, and this is what it looks like. So those that are here today, thank you for being here. Those that are watching at home or in your offices, thank you for joining us. And Ben, welcome back to Houston.
Thank you.
We're in Asia Society. So let me talk about China and this and pull China in, because China's Belt and Road Initiative. You talk a little bit about how Viktor Orban basically took support from China, right, in terms of what China was able to do. Because sitting in Houston, not just we're in Asia Society, but Houston is a gateway to Latin America. Houston does a ton of business in Africa. And we've seen China go into these areas with suitcase full of cash, and sometimes American businesses aren't as competitive. Connect that for our audience.
So, I'll start in Hungary and move to China, and then, back to Hungary in a way. Today, Hungary, European Union member state, China is very active there. Hungary is the first European country to sign up to the Belt Road Initiative. They are building a large Chinese university in Hungary. The single largest Huawei facility outside of China is in Hungary. Orban receives the benefit of this Chinese investment, and I think a significant amount of under-the-table Chinese money. And in exchange, what China gets is a foothold in Europe, a made in the EU stamp on Huawei, and it kind of serves both interests. When I was in government, Obama and I used to have kind of a dark joke when we go into meetings with a number of countries in Southeast Asia along the Belt and Road Initiative, which was trying to guess how many people on the other side of the table were receiving direct payments from China. Basically, they use corruption as a lubricant for the advancement of their interests, in the sense that a lot of the projects that they are building on the Belt Road Initiative don't have a lot of benefit to the populations. They come in, they build, in Southeast Asia, they come in, they build these huge dams that are meant to provide energy back into China. They build it with Chinese labor. That's not really benefiting people in Southeast Asia, but they're paying off people in those governments, and it suits them for those governments to be more autocratic, because it's easier to deal with autocratic governments, it's easier to pay off autocratic governments, and it keeps democracy at arm's length. And so there is a kind of system that has spread, I think, most pointedly from Russia and China, in which corruption is utilized both to perpetuate authoritarian politics and to service the kind of economic and, in some cases, personal interests of autocratic leaders.
How does the system, or the autocratic system, control not just the population, but from people speaking out against them?
I think I'll give you the example of Alexei Navalny, and Boris Nemtsov. So in my book, I profile in the Russia section Zhana Nemtsova is a young Russian woman, remarkable woman. Her father's named Boris Nemtsov. He was a leading critic of Vladimir Putin and really the chief opposition figure to Putin before Navalny. And he really focused in on corruption and trying to expose and publicize Putin's corruption. And he was killed, shot and assassinated right in front of the Kremlin in 2015. And that's a message, right? That a Putin doesn't have to kill all of his opponents, but you make an example of somebody, and it has a chilling effect. We're in an age of the kind of autocracy in which it's not like the Stalin years where hundreds of thousands of people are thrown in gulags. The Putin methodology that you see mimicked by other leaders is, if you make an example of one person, it has a chilling effect on other people. A Navalny comes along, and I really enjoyed my conversations with him. He described to me, what he did, which is essentially he started in politics, but he realized that in politics, Putin could sufficiently divide oppositions against one another, fracture parties, rig elections, that organized politics wasn't how he wanted to take on Vladimir Putin. So what he did is he basically became an investigative journalist and a blogger. And he did something quite clever because he had a legal and financial background. He sued all of the Russian state oil companies to get access to their books, essentially. Russia still in those days had enough of a legal framework where he could do that, and basically exposed the fact that billions of dollars were going missing in these transactions. Presumably, that's what was going into the Russian government or to Putin's personal circle. And then over time, Navalny got very innovative in publicizing Putin's corruption. He made videos exposing lavish residences and became a populist himself. And he was, if Putin tapped into the grievances at the loss of the Soviet Union and the way in which the 90s Russians felt kind of totally screwed by the way in which state enterprises were siphoned off to oligarchs, Navalny was the next generation of populist who was exposing how wealthy Putin and his circle were, and how this corruption was really the lifeblood of the regime in Russia. But now what Putin has done, of course, is he's poisoned Navalny a couple of times. I talked to Navalny after he'd already been poisoned once, and he said, look, he does this to show everybody in the country that he can control you, that you don't know what's going to happen, that you could be poisoned one day, that you could be arrested one day. He doesn't have to arrest everybody. He just has to make that example of somebody. And part of what was chilling to me is I had been talking to Navalny in the summer of 2020, at the end of which he's poisoned and nearly killed. I texted with him while he was in Germany recovering. He said, I'm going back into Russia. He went back to Russia, was imprisoned, and his organization started to get rolled up. To circle all the way back to your question, therefore, it's the way in which they deal with activism is to make a sufficient example of people that it has a chilling effect, while also, passing laws that limit the capacity for there to be an independent civil society.
So on the one hand, it is that extreme measure of poisoning somebody not once but multiple times, and using the kind of poison where you go like, I know it's Putin because nobody else has access to to the kind of materials that he was poisoned with. On the other hand, you graduated from Rice. You watched the Houston Rockets play. You got a call from the coach of the Rockets because he had put out a tweet. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I'll start with the Rockets and build out from that because it connects these different threads we've been talking about. So Daryl Morey called me after he tweeted a pretty innocuous tweet. Daryl had said, essentially, stand for freedom, support Hong Kong, which was a slogan of the Hong Kong protest movement. In response, there's this huge backlash from the Chinese government. The NBA games are yanked off of CCTV in China. Basically, the NBA, which has a multi-billion-dollar business in China, is put on deep freeze. There's enormous volume of anger stirred up in Chinese media. And there's something very interesting about this, though, which I pointed out to Daryl. There's no Twitter in China. So they chose to be offended. Nobody had to see that tweet. They wanted to take the opportunity of that to send a message, not just to the NBA, but to anybody who does business in China. Just stay out. Don't talk about Hong Kong. If anything, if you or a single employee of any business that operates in China says anything that we don't like about our politics, you could lose everything. Don't think for a second that not only did every NBA player and executive see that, anybody who does business in China saw that, and it's not the first time that they've done that. And what's interesting to me about that is, on the extreme end of this, the Hong Kong protesters who I talked to, what they described as white terror, this is a common phrase in Hong Kong, is the sense that it just became understood that you had to self-censor. If you wanted to get ahead in even Hong Kong society, when Hong Kong used to be allegedly its own system, you didn't say certain things in public. You didn't post certain things on social media. You didn't send emails that said certain things because you knew that somebody could be monitoring those emails. You didn't search certain websites. And in talking to Hong Kong young people, what was so terrifying to them is what they realized is this is an effort to not only control kind of what we say in public, it's an effort to kind of control what we think. Because if we can't even access certain information or act on having certain opinions, if we want to get a good job or we want to go to a good university, they're trying to engineer how we think about things. Obviously, in mainland China, this is already fully in place, where you just know you don't do or say certain things if you want to have any hope of having opportunity in the society. Now, connecting Daryl's story to that, I realized, when's the last time you saw a movie made in this country that is critical of China? You don't, because they need to be in the Chinese market, you know? Who do you think is financing the Chinese technology that is being utilized for surveillance? It's half of it's American venture capital. Not because Americans want to be autocratic. The evolution of the structure of the global economy is such that we're all self-censoring. We all have to think twice before we say certain things if we have an economic interest in a place like China. And so that's, and I don't, this happens in slow motion. Like 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable that an innocuous comment by the Rockets GM would imperil billions of dollars of business for the NBA. Today, it's not that surprising. Like this is happening before our eyes without us kind of stepping back and really considering whether that's the future that we want.
I want to go in a little different direction. I worked for the Department of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2008, and I worked on a project called the Transatlantic Dialogue. We took a group of people from the United States to the United Kingdom, brought some people from there to here, and in that process, it's kind of the program that you at your level would create, me at my low level will get a contract to go do. One of those, you big deal, me little guy. Right?
Well, we all end up back on the outside, so it equals out.
So, in doing that, one thing that kept on coming back to me on the plane ride back, and I was working on this memo, it's like, what do we learn from this? And as people were introducing themselves, I realized that there was not just first generation, second generation, third generation people there that came from somewhere else and settled in the United Kingdom, but still thought of themselves as Asian. They weren't British Asian, they were just Asian. And when you come to the other side of the Atlantic, you might be an Irishman, but you're an Irish American. You're Italian American, you're Jewish American, you're Muslim American. We have this hyphen. And so anytime somebody lands in our country, the identity America gets attached to it. And back then, this is almost like 15 years ago, I started thinking about this notion of identity. And I thought in that memo that I wrote about building resilient communities was that Europe needs some kind of a hyphen like we have. And so this issue of identity has been something that I've worked at and thought about for a long time. Fast forward, I'm reading your book, and all of a sudden, you pick up this notion of identity as one of the driving challenges of our time. Take a minute and talk about identity from your frame, and why is that so important for all of us to understand?
Well, it's a connecting thread to what we've been talking about, because what I found in Hungary, for instance, is that, already after the Cold War, you have this incredibly hopeful moment. And you also have this kind of belief that the big questions have been settled. The big ideological debates of the 20th century have been settled. The battle between communism and capitalism, or democracy and communist dictatorship. And then you have this age of globalization. And in talking to Hungarians and Russians and others about their experience, and Chinese in an important way, which I'll get to in a second, we all felt, I think even in the 90s and aughts, with all the benefits of globalization, there's this kind of encroachment on traditional identity. And so life is getting more homogenized suddenly. And culture globally is getting more homogenized. And that's something that everybody's dealing with. And that's what they're kind of dealing with in Hungary, to just take the Hungarian example. The deal is kind of like, we're losing something, but we're gaining a lot. We're gaining better standards of living. We're gaining connectivity and access to information. Then, in what I think is a much more important event than is even fully appreciated, the bottom falls out of the global economic system in 2007, 2008. And suddenly, not only is there like an encroachment on our identity, but the deal isn't working out. And people suffered a lot more around the world than they even did here in the financial crisis. And then an Orban comes along and says, I'm going to offer you the most familiar political message in history, which is an ethno-nationalist identity. You're pissed. You think that this system let you down. You're already frustrated about like the changes that are happening around you. Let's just turn back the clock and go back to the traditional Christian Hungarian identity. And that was the core of Orban's message. That was the core of Putin's message. By the way, it's not just a white and Christian thing. It's the core of Tayyip Erdogan's message in Turkey. That's the core of Bibi Netanyahu's message in Israel. That's certainly the core of Narendra Modi's message in India. I'm offering you guys the traditional identity. And for that to be a potent political message, by the way, it usually has to be an us versus them identity. We're over here, and I'm going to create another for us to be in opposition to. Brexit, since you mentioned the UK, I actually think the purest manifestation of this politics was the slogan for Brexit, take back control, which combines this sense of people wanting to resist encroaching forces, but also wanting to kind of reclaim a traditional set of identity. It's the other side of a coin of make America great again. And so I think on the one hand, you've had the dominant strain in global politics since the financial crisis be this kind of reassertion of whatever the traditional identity is, wherever it is. And to get back to China, I had some really interesting conversations with some mainland Chinese about the degree to which when the Communist Party after the Cold War kind of lost their legitimacy, right? But they're not for global communist revolution anymore. What they did is they really resuscitated traditional Chinese identity. After banishing Confucius in the Mao days, Confucius was seen as a threat by Mao Zedong. Very gradually in the 90s, suddenly they embraced Confucius, and they're putting up Confucius statues, and they're setting up Confucius centers around the world. And they're embracing the Chinese Communist Party not as the defender of global communist revolution, but as the defender of traditional Chinese identity. So I think identity becomes the kind of common thread of this kind of nationalist authoritarian strain of politics that we see. It's ironic to me that identity politics in this country was usually used to describe, ethnic minority politics. Right now, the dominant strain of identity politics in the world is majoritarian ethnic identity politics. And the battle in the world today, the political fault lines are people trying to reclaim an identity politics in which you can have more than one identity. You can have a hyphen. And the young Hungarian, for instance, who I talked to, who started a political party that's getting traction in Hungary now, is like, I hate this. I'm Hungarian, but I'm also European. I don't, why can't I be both of those things? And most young people I talk to today feel like they have multiple identities. I feel like I have multiple identities. My mother's Jewish, my father's Christian. My dad's from Texas, my mom's from New York. That's, to me, being American is having multiple identities. But I think that in the absence of the ideological competition, the communist versus the 20th century isms, that what's happening now is this question of whether or not we can live in societies in which people have multiple identities, or whether we have to once again go back to, frankly, what has been the norm in history, where a sole identity is the dominant actor in a society. And in this country, that would be a white Christian identity as the dominant actor, or whether we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy.
Go back a little bit. You talked a little bit about the 2008 crash in 2007 when it began and how it kind of had a tectonic shift. But talk a little bit about post the Cold War, where our country headed. Because I thought that was I think it's an important time that we could have decided what direction to head as a nation.
Yeah, I think when I look back on this as someone whose kind of political consciousness emerged in the 90s, what's interesting was this country's national identity, right? Separate from the ethnic issues I was just talking about. When I was growing up, I'm old enough, obviously, to have this memory, our identity was very tied up in the Cold War, And so, we agreed on certain things across party lines. Like we were for freedom and democracy and capitalism and open societies, and the other guys were for communism and dictatorship. And that had a certain organizing principle to American society. Our politics, there were guardrails around our politics because of the Cold War. We couldn't be too irresponsible in our politics because we had to fight and win this Cold War. The popular culture, right? I mean, I grew up on Rocky IV, and I mentioned this in the book, but there was something to the fact that people of different political persuasions could feel a common purpose and cause and sense of patriotism around this one thing that really did organize kind of how we thought about being American in the world from World War II to the end of the Cold War. I think that a huge vacuum opened up in the 90s where nothing replaced that. And that in a way, some of the political pitched battles and partisanship that began to emerge in the 90s and has obviously continued to get more acute ever since had to do in part with the absence of that kind of unifying sense of national identity. I think the closest we came to it was after September 11th, where, and I talk about this in the book, but where suddenly the national identity is kind of affixed to the war on terrorism. But I don't think the war on terrorism is certainly not of a scale of the Cold War in terms of the ideas that are at stake and who the enemy is, and in many ways, the excesses of the war on terror were almost like people trying to build it out to be as consequential as the Cold War, and that kind of leads you deeper into places like Afghanistan and Iraq, but I think that if people want to know why the politics is so contested right now in this country, it's because we are contesting what it means to be American. I mean, this is why I made it the subtitle of my book. Like, we don't have an agreement to that question right now of just what it means to be American. Barack Obama, my boss forever, his basic whole political identity is an argument that what it means is to be a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that is constantly in pursuit of embracing our differences into a single whole. I think Donald Trump represents very much the opposite of that view. And I think that does account for that post-Cold War, Obama has one answer to that question, Trump obviously has another. I think that Bush's was really the war on terror. I think that we have not had anything, not that everything was rosy times in the Cold War, but I do think what we have not had since then is a kind of unifying story as Americans about who we are and who we are in the world. And the world can sense that.
We've had some heavy conversation. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask the audience to ask your questions. There'll be a microphone that'll be going around, so you'll have an opportunity to ask. So start thinking about those questions. I want to go to something a little bit different. You brought it up, so you brought it up. You talked about Rocky. My kids will make fun of me because, Rocky is kind of like a good point for us to kind of end on and let the audience ask more questions. It's always very simple, right? Who's good, who's evil, right? The debates are just simplified for you. You know who you're rooting for. It feels like the world has just gotten a lot more complicated. What you're seeing on your phones sometimes is not what it's supposed to be. It's being fed to you in a different way. Arguments that are being made at times are being made for a particular political interest. You're not supposed to know what to say sometimes because there might be a repercussion of what happens. And so sometimes people just want to turn away. The politics of the globe are becoming in a way where you don't want to know anymore. So there's a part in the book that I thought was really interesting, where you you found out, your wife, and you found out that you were potentially being spied on, and you kind of had enough, and you decided to leave Washington and go to LA. And in the book, you talked about that at one point you were running, and you see the skyline of Los Angeles, and you take a moment and go like, this is what people that are, this is how I read it, disengaged feel like the skyline doesn't change. It's always the skyline. And maybe knowing too much can be a problem, and somehow if they make it icky enough, you don't want to know the system. I'm doing a horrible job at explaining that. Help our audience understand that concept.
So, yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I guess I'd answer it this way, and working around to the personal piece. You know, Obama is a character in the book who comes in and out where we're just kind of talking about these things. And towards the end, I relay a conversation where he says, well, you know, why don't you describe, you know, kind of what you've written? And I give him my point of view. And he says, well, look, Ben, that there's always this competition in history. There's always a competition between democracy and autocracy and you know, progressive and reactionary politics. You know, what do you think is really, truly different today? And I thought about it for a second, I said, well, technology is what's different. Because technology is what can scale up surveillance and disinformation. So the Chinese dynamic I described, you know, it's one thing to have a police state where, you know, there are people watching you outside, but it's another thing where, like, the state can literally be everywhere, from, you know, your phone, your data, what have you. It's one thing when people can have conspiracy theories, but it's another thing when social media can so rapidly and comprehensively spread those conspiracy theories and kind of lock people into information ecosystems that 40 to 45% of the country can just live in a reality that's not true. You know, that, you know, vaccines don't work, or, you know, Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States, or humans aren't responsible for climate change, or Donald Trump won the last election, or the scaling up of those conspiracy theories is aided by technology is qualitatively different than anything we've experienced before as a society, because reality itself starts to escape. Now, to connect this to the personal point that you mentioned, what was interesting about that is I learned through the press in like 2018 that you know, a report comes out, a group of ex-Mossad Black Cube had been hired to spy on me, dig up dirt on me. They had some notoriety because they'd similarly been hired to dig up dirt or discredit Harvey Weinstein's accusers. So somehow I entered into the Me Too. There's some intersectionality of whatever. And, you know, at first, it's just a little disconcerting. I went back, prompted by journalists through my emails, and there was some email outreach to my wife seeking to find personal information. But then, you know, I talked to some people. This was real. There was a file on me that journalists had gotten. It had pictures of my apartment and pictures of my car and my parents' phone number, and then multiple friends of mine are like, yes, I've had this weird outreach. And so it's disconcerting enough that people had spied on me. But then to connect it to the technology point, when my first book was coming out, my agent, literary agent, said, hey, you know, your Google's a dumpster fire. And I was like, yeah, tell me about it. You know, like don't have a lot of fans on the far right of this country. And she's like, well, I'm going to connect you to one of these guys who kind of cleans up your reputation online. And I was like, that sounds kind of sketchy, but, you know, if you want me to have this conversation, I'll have the conversation. The guy quoted me how much money this cost, and I was like, well, I'm not, you know, I can't do that. And he came back, this guy actually came back to me a few weeks later, and he said, actually, you know, it'd be much more expensive. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to do it. And he said, no, it's interesting. I looked into your online profile, and someone is doing to you what we would do for you. And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, well, what we do is we click on all the good stories about you so that they go to the top of your Google search, so that people Google Ben Rhodes, they think you're this great guy. someone has been very methodically and relentlessly doing the opposite to you, so that, basically someone's been trying to, destroy my reputation online. He's like the top story about you on the internet is like some blog post, but it has a headline that says Ben Rhodes is an asshole. and that's what they want people to know about you. Anyway, the point of this is that the combination of the kind of tradition, of this kind of new world of private spying and technology and the ugliness of politics, all of that is part of what kind of made me feel like I need a break. I want to get out of this. But then also in the reporting and writing of this book, you realize in every society, in every single person I talk to, the objective of every autocrat, of every stripe, is to make people cynical or apathetic or to say it's not worth it. That's the whole goal. And the second that people say, you know what, I'm turning off the TV. I can't look at any more of this. This is too ugly. That's the whole point. It's to make it look so ugly that you disengage. And technology makes it easier for people to do that because it's really ugly on your phone. Whenever you open that up, you probably have the impulse to turn that down. And we have to recognize that's a deliberate strategy. That's not some state of nature. People are trying to make you feel like this whole thing is not worth it. Because the second that people do that, well, you're left with Putin and Xi Jinping. And in this country, I won't even have to tell you who I think that is.
What questions do you have? Is there somebody walking around with the mic? Charles has got a question.
I'm sure you've been asked this. Given what happened in Kabul, was there any discussion right after the very successful strike that killed Osama bin Laden, or President Obama just said, this is the time to end the war? I'm sure that discussion must have happened.
Yeah, I made that argument at that time, actually, myself. And look, we were at the height of what had been the surge in Afghanistan. And kind of what we'd found in that surge is that was the period of time in which we were most effective in our counterterrorism operations, basically kind of wiping out al-Qaeda, obviously getting bin Laden, but frankly not achieving the other objectives of the surge, to kind of build up an Afghan security force and kind of implant governance in Afghanistan. And so we did initiate a plan to draw down U.S. forces from 100,000 in 2011 to 10,000 in 2014, and to have the Afghan security forces move into the kind of lead responsibility. And that was the state of play for the last couple of years of the Obama administration. And I was at the end of the spectrum of people kind of arguing that we have to understand the limits of what we're going to do here. Obama looked at the question of whether to take everybody out at the end of his presidency. The assessment was that basically if you did that, what would happen is what we just saw happen. Coincidentally, at that time, there was also when ISIS had reemerged, and there was some concern about ISIS coming in Afghanistan. And Obama thought about it and basically made the decision that, look, it's the end of my presidency. It's 2016. I think the next president, and I really don't think this was him ducking. I think this is him saying, particularly knowing that Hillary was a Democratic nominee and Hillary's a pretty hawkish figure on these issues. I don't want to make this decision for them. I'll leave 10,000 troops. There were no casualties, or very minimal U.S. casualties. I think that the responsible thing to do is to kind of leave a low enough force that the Afghans are in the lead for fighting and we're not taking casualties. But then the next president can make a determination as to whether to basically complete the drawdown. And then what you had is a very schizophrenic Trump presidency. In retrospect, by the way, I think we made a mistake. I don't think the surge was the right idea. I would have liked to, not that I was calling the shot. I wasn't running the war in Afghanistan, but I think in retrospect, it would have been good to have all troops out by the end of the Obama presidency if we could have done that. Trump surged at first. That's what was so odd, is that when McMaster and Mattis were there was actually this surge where several thousand troops were put back into Afghanistan, American troops went back into combat. And basically, once all those generals were out, then Trump just started trying to yank everybody out, and it went down to 2,500. and then you get Biden. But yeah, I think that actually, in retrospect, I would have preferred that post Bin Laden, that there be an even swifter trajectory, essentially, to the unwinding of not just the war in Afghanistan, but a lot of the global infrastructure of the war on terror. That I believe that I think it's look, there's a real threat. I don't want to minimize that, but I think we have to trust that we have enough capacity to deal with that without having this kind of vast infrastructure of drone strikes and obviously not having troops in places like Afghanistan, but also because all we've been talking about tonight, that takes a lot of bandwidth. You know, climate change, to me, if you look out at the world, the biggest issues that are going to define the next 20 years or 30 years, the survivability of democracy, as we've been talking about, climate change, and kind of emerging technology and how we deal with that. Terrorism is not, in my view, like a top even 5 issue for America and the world. And our government doesn't reflect that. Our budget doesn't reflect that. The things we spend time on in the world doesn't reflect that. And so in part of the argument I make in the book is that we have to catch up to that. Because frankly, the biggest beneficiary of the fact that America's fought a 20-year war is China.
Question up there in the back. Right there.
Ben, you talked about the chipping away of democracy, and I've been thinking about the preamble to the Constitution. I grew up in Los Angeles, and in the 50s, when before the television shows came on, there was this face of an Indian, and you would stare at this test pattern for a few hours. What should have been on that screen was the preamble to the Constitution. Most people in this country have no idea that what's on a $10 bill, we ta people, you can't read we the people, but you assume that. Most people don't even know that those are the first 3 words of the preamble, and they have no idea that in the preamble it says this country is supposed to promote the general welfare. So my thought to you, my question to you is, do you think promoting the ideas that are in the preamble of the Constitution is a way to get us back towards the precepts that this country was, even though it was white male controlled, but the precepts were the precepts that this country should stand for?
I mean, I think that there's a whole, I think that the failures in education in this country are pretty profound, and that includes kind of a sense of civic identity. I guess I'll just show my cards on this thing. There's a whole question about how do you improve the school system in this country. I'm not the best person to answer those questions. What I will say is, in looking at authoritarianism, the story you tell people about the past is central to who you are in the present and who you will be in the future. Every authoritarian I looked at in this book understands that. Viktor Orban has systematically changed Hungary's curriculum to minimize the contributions of Jewish writers and people, of people who are socialist. He's kind of whitewashed Hungarian complicity in the Holocaust. He's basically tried to create he's changed, and I describe in the book, like literal statues have come down if you're on the wrong side, and then statues have gone up if you're on the far right side. And China, the extreme version of this is that I met young Chinese who said that until they left China, that they weren't aware that Tiananmen Square happened. That if you grow up and come of age in China, you don't know that people were killed in Tiananmen Square. Putin has rehabilitated Stalin. People have fights about the past. Those fights are really about the future. And to just put my cards on the table in Texas, there's this kind of question of American exceptionalism generally. I believe in American exceptionalism, but I think my definition of American exceptionalism is different than others. it's not that we've always had all the answers and America is infallible and we should be just teaching our children America's the greatest country in the world just because. American exceptionalism is our capacity to better ourselves because of those founding documents, because the Constitution and the framework given to us by our founding fathers not only was the best system of government, but because it gave future citizens the capacity to improve upon things and to right historical wrongs, right? And so when you have debates about, you call it critical race theory, call it whatever you want, if you're essentially saying that we should minimize the teaching of structural inequities in the history of this society, that's not about the past, that's about the present and the future. That's about saying America is the greatest because we're America, and that's what we're going to tell our kids. No, America is about doing the work. And the Constitution is the framework that gives us the capacity to do the work. That's the genius of it. And so I think that we have to see these culture war debates that can seem just about small things or about really, really big things. So to me, there's the issue of both the quality of education, but there's also the issue of just how we, again, coming back to identity, like we are, are we the greatest country on earth just because we are, because it's anointed and inevitable? Or are we the greatest country on earth because we have the capacity to right wrongs and to recognize injustice and to teach about injustice so that we can correct it? And I think that's why, again, why these debates that can seem maddening, they're actually very, very important.
Okay, one last question right up here. No, it's great. One last one right there.
So I have a question. It's actually about identity. So I want you've so very eloquently talked about so many things. So can you just describe how, from Ben Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor, in an intense situation for so many years, with so many responsibilities, how do you, as you have mentioned, become outsider and spit out? How does that journey become personal for you, from that position to Ben again?
To what, sorry?
To Ben, to yourself.
Ben, yeah.
So how does that rehabilitative process happen? Is it, because it must be very intense and the switch is overnight and it's very, abrupt. Like you said, it's very disorienting. So I think it's a lot of young people in the audience who want to get to these amazing positions, and thank you for what you did, and all of us who are doing that. But how's the journey backwards, if you don't mind?
I love that question. And it's a good question, Anand. And I'll say, and this is like, I hope people read the book, because if you do, you'll see that's what the book, it's a very personal book. What was interesting is I didn't set out to be the Deputy National Security Advisor. I felt compelled to get into international relations after 9/11 because I witnessed the attacks in New York and wanted to be kind of a part of what happened next, and that kind of propelled me down to DC. And then I didn't like the direction that the country had taken after 9/11 and the Iraq War and the excesses of that age, and so I wanted to get in politics to change that, and that led me to work for Barack Obama. I'm obviously, truth be told, that sounds like it was super easy. I mean, clearly, I had privileges and luck and all kinds of things that allowed that to happen. And then for 8 years, I'm at the center of power in my 30s. Not me myself, but I'm close to it. I'm in the White House working with Barack Obama. I became very personally close to Barack Obama. And then I'm spit out and I'm 39 years old. And I'm like, what the hell am I going to do with the rest of my life? And for me, part of what in the course of writing this book, I'm talking to basically outsiders. I'm talking to Hong Kong protesters and Alexei Navalny and Hungarian oppositionists. And to me, the book was a bit of a journey because I came to kind of realize, and this is not a judgment because everybody has a different role. way back in my introduction, we talked about my friend Jake. He's now the National Security Advisor. We're the same age. We were on parallel courses in a lot of ways. I didn't feel when I left government like I wanted to, again, and this is not a criticism of anything, because I want good people to be in government, but I was like, I don't feel like I want to stay in DC and wait at the think tank until my party wins and I can go into government again. I feel more like an outsider, I feel more, and to find my own voice, I had to feel like I could be unencumbered by, hey, how's this gonna, if you listen to my podcast, and I don't presume anybody does, but like, how's this gonna sound if this clip is played at my Senate confirmation hearing, or I better censor what, I don't like self-censorship. I don't, and so the process of writing the book was kind of almost a process of me saying, in order for me to speak as honestly as I can about power, which I think I understand better than I would otherwise because I've been in a position of power, I have to just kind of let it rip and let it go and say things that might make it much less likely that I'll ever be in a position like that again. And that was difficult. And if you read the book, I think it's actually the most distinct thing about it and personal thing about it is I'm kind of writing my way out of the perspective of someone in power. I know what it's like to have to get on television and just defend the line. And I might agree with 80% of it, but I'm going to agree 100% of it because that's my job, And I think in this book, and it's not just, it's funny because some people, the kind of Washington version of this is, well, where are you critical of the Obama years? And if you read the book, yeah, I'm critical of things in the Obama years. That's not to me what's interesting. It's hey, this whole system and structure, like I saw how it worked. Like it needs to change. And by the way, like Barack Obama couldn't have changed it by himself. We make a mistake in thinking that one president can change inequality in society or change a foreign policy that doesn't see people outside the United States as equal human beings to people in the United States. That's not about presidents, or that's about, and again, that's why the subtitle's Being American, that's about who we choose to be as Americans and how that is reflected in the world, right? So to me, and reflecting on what I love about America and the culture I end the whole book with the image of Jackie Robinson stealing home. I like America as the country of underdogs. And that may be because I have a Jewish immigrant background in me. And frankly, my father, who's from Baytown, did not come from a wealthy family. But I think America at its best is supposed to represent underdogs. It's supposed to represent the outsiders. It's supposed to represent the people who, against the odds, do really big things. And I think hegemony didn't suit us well, because that's not what's best about us. And so I wanted to kind of align myself in the narrative of this book with that kind of, and at me all you want that, look at you, Rhodes, you were in the White House. Fine, I get the criticism is true. I'm a white dude, I worked in the White House, it's true. So but I do think that America as a whole needs to kind of recover the mindset of what it means to be an outsider looking at power or an underdog. Because frankly, that is what has allowed America to kind of remake the world. We were the country founded in opposition to existing structures. And I think if we get back to that, that will be so meaningful to all the types of people I talk about around the world. That's what people want from us. They want to, all these people, even through the Trump years, they love that part of America. Whether they're Hong Kong protesters or Alexei Navalny or the Hungarians, they want America to stand for something in the world. And we can do that again.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Rhodes. So Ben, I want to thank you, not just for being back in Houston and being on the Asia Society stage, but for years of public service. As the question implied, it is not easy. And so we appreciate the sacrifice that it takes to do that, and we encourage others to do the same. We are honoring on the 7th, October 7th, on our Huffington Awards, former Secretary Bob Gates. Our friend Ali Velshi will be interviewing him, so we encourage you to come back to that's our next big live event. For those of you watching online, you have to register for that event, but come live for that one. We want you there in person. Ben, you're going to be signing book outside, so here's my ask. Get the book, but read the book.
Yes.
Right? Like, get the book, but read the book. This is something that is, I think there's content here that's important and that's incredibly valuable for all of us to digest. And then my second ask is, Ben's got a problem on the internet. You're gonna have to go on some site and write a review about the book too, right? You're gonna have to do that as well. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for being here. Ben, thank you so much for.
Thanks.
Round of applause again.
Thank you, guys.